Boa noite a todos, obrigado pela vossa presença. Como hoje temos um convidado estrangeiro, permitam-me que passe a comunicar em inglês. Good evening, thanks for your time and for being here. I would just like to make a brief introduction about Oficina da Liberdade. Oficina da Liberdade is a civic and cultural association, and its mission is to defend the principles of liberty, namely spontaneous order of society based on individual ethics and morals. As you probably know, but I would like to stress that in the past 2 years, our activities have included the organization of a cycle of thematic workshops and talks in Porto and Lisbon, the edition of a book with a collection of original articles authored by almost 30 contributors. Oficina da Liberdade has a weekly opinion column at Observador, an online newspaper in Portugal that probably Alejandro has heard of it. And we have already finished the edition of a new book about the history of liberalism in Portugal, but due to the pandemic, we have not been able to make its public announcement or presentation, but we'll do so in the coming months. During COVID-19 times, Oficina da Liberdade has been organizing a few online debates, and today we are especially honored to have as our distinguished guests two fantastic scholars and long-time champions and campaigners of individual liberties. I'll start by introducing briefly, because his CV is very long, but I'll start by introducing Alejandro Chafuen, who I had just the pleasure of meeting him personally once in Portugal a few months ago. Alejandro is from Argentina. He was president and CEO of the Atlas Network for more than 25 years, I suppose. He holds a PhD in economics and is a specialist in the Salamanca School of Thought and author of several books, but Faith and Liberty, that was published in several languages. He is member of the Mont Pelerin Society, that was created by after the Second World War as an initiative of Friedrich Hayek to discuss the state and the possible fate of classical liberalism. Alessandro now is managing director of the international division of the Acton Institute, which is the Acton Institute is one of the world-leading think tanks, and whose mission is to promote a free society sustained by religious principles. Andres Vidwalv is a friend of us. He has been collaborating also in the book that we've edited and published 1 year ago now. And he's assistant professor of the Universidade Católica Portuguesa. He holds a PhD from the London School of Economics. He's currently coordinator of the Institute of Political Studies Research Center, the same university. Is also reader at St. Mary's University in London. He is affiliate of the Benedict XVI Center of Study of Religion and Society at this British university as well. André, as Alejandro, is also a member of the exclusive Mont Pelerin Society. This said, on Oficina da Liberdade behalf, I would like to thank you both and conclude this introduction by giving the word to André, that will conduct this live session, which will certainly address some topics of great relevance And I suppose, and I hope that it will be sufficiently controversial to stimulate and challenge the role of the Catholic Church and the Catholics in Portugal in a cultural environment that is increasingly dependent on state, and we have to deal more and more with the causes of progressivism. And thus, I suppose that we are in a crucial time to defend and promote the importance and the preservation of the individual freedom. André, now it's up to you. Thanks, and have a good discussion.
Thank you, Telmo. Let me start by thanking Oficina da Liberdade. I think it's actually I did contribute to the book, but it's my first event that I'm very glad to work. I've been following Oficina's efforts for the past months and recent times, so I'm very glad to be here, and it's also a special privilege to be here with my longtime friend Alejandro Chafuen, and also has been a long-time example for me. So it's a real honor to do this with Alejandro. So the format for the session will be Alejandro will start by an introductory short lecture of about 25 minutes, and then we'll have about 30 to 40 minutes of discussion, where we'll also be able to take in questions that people can make through, I think, the Facebook live transmission. So as we go along, feel free to make questions, and then during the Q&A period, we'll try to address as many of the issues as possible. Telmo has already introduced Alejandro Chafuen, so I'm not going to repeat. I'd just like to mention that Alejandro was also personally a key influence for me in several domains, both in as an example in the defense of classical liberalism, and more particularly in the study of the late scholastics, a topic that I became interested over the course of the last about 15 years. And Alejandro has a lot of work on the subject, and actually the lecture will touch upon that as well, has been a key influence. And so he's one of the main persons responsible for my own involvement in the field. That's an additional reason why I'm so glad to have him here. And the second note, I'd also like to stress that Alejandro has also been a longtime friend of the Institute for Political Studies at the Catholic University. He's been with us many times at Estoril Political Forum, our summer conference, where he has been for the last few editions, also involved in the session where we present the Faith and Liberty Award. So I think the topic is also specially suited in this case. Without further ado, Alejandro, you have the floor, the online floor.
Thank you so much, Andrea and Oficina da Liberdade. I had the pleasure to be with some of you earlier this year. I'm a big admirer. I like a lot about Portugal. I think only 2% of my DNA is Portuguese, but much more of that is in my heart. So thank you for allowing to make reflections on this topic that is not easy. I seldom speak about faith and Catholicism. I mostly speak about liberty. But for many decades, especially after my return to the church, these two worlds of faith and liberty and faith within the Catholic Christian tradition, that has been my world. On matters of faith and Catholicism, I think the best thing I can do is, rather than speaking, is practice what I believe. Through my family life, through my professional life, with my friends like Andrea and Catholic University of Portugal, and now with Oficina da Liberdade. Although I was raised as a Roman Catholic, I came from a family, especially from the father's side, that were very rebels. My grandfather from the Italian part was really from Istria, south of Venice. He did his PhD in Vienna, and religion he looked down upon it. But my grandmother, also from that same area, She prayed the rosary very early. And so when we left the church, she was always praying for us. Same with my dad. My father came from the Anglican side. My grandfather was like a Spencerian anarchist. So luckily, through the female side of my family, I was baptized. I also went to school, to a high school founded by Scottish Presbyterians in 1838. Part of my university was at the Catholic University, but also at the Presbyterian College, founded in the 1870s, and I'm on the board of this Presbyterian College in the United States. But I really was one of those enemies of the faith. Those of you in the free market movement know about Ayn Rand, the pseudonym of this great Russian writer. I was a complete fanatic of her works. I recruited some of the top Randians in Argentina. They're still leading in the objectivist movement. But that made me feel respect for people who without faith, still have a moral drive to defend the freedom of the individual. I think it was in the middle of my Catholic university where I started to change. And again, rational arguments were not enough. I studied the 5 ways of St. Thomas, but it was a mixture of things brought me to Catholicism. And I started to study seriously the church, social doctrine of the church, because at the time I was at the university, the Catholic Church, there was a movement called the Liberation Theology movement that was really intertwined with terrorism. Only later I learned that in the convent where the Catholic universities was based, we had even a terrorist cell inside the university. And I was already a freedom fighter. I said, I better learn as much as I can, what is the doctrine behind the church. And so I started studying not because of my faith, but just to understand this movement. What is regarded the first social encyclica, Rerum Novarum, or New Thing, had wonderful passages against socialism in favor of private property, helping us to understand the natural inequality. It even has a strong statement saying that no one can really be a true socialist and a true Christian. But nevertheless, the priests and the professors, and they were teaching exactly the opposite. There was a Latin American Bible that had all the approvals, the Nihil Obstat and the Imprimatur. It was called the Latin American Bible, a green book. That was basically, when they spoke about the promised land, it had a picture of Cuba, and of promoting the faith. It had the picture of a guerrilla with a machine gun. So that is I was brought up. I studied all the encyclicas. The professor commended me at the time. There was a book in Spain. I know it's in Portuguese. Denzinger was there, who had recopilated all the documents of the church. I knew them by heart. So I think I was well prepared to fight the idea of Christian socialism. One of the first priests that was writing about that is a Jesuit who's now dead, Enrique Menendez Ureña, Spanish priest. He also became a member of the Mont Pelerin Society. Unfortunately, he died young. He wrote a book that I do not know if it's in Portuguese, but it's called in Spanish, El mito del socialismo cristiano, and in English, the myth of Christian socialism. But in English was published by Franciscan Herald Press. And the whole goal was we had to prove that we could be Christians if we believe in the free economy. And Father Menendez Ureña, started giving them, okay, look, I assume your goodwill. You want to reach this goal to improve the liberty of people, but let's see what happens when you impose your model. So in a very rational and respectful way, he showed the importance of the free economy for the life of the Christian, and putting in practice Christian principles. At the time also, there are authors that I think for you, I assume they are well known in Portugal, especially through the entrepreneurial associations of Catholics, that there was a period between the 40s and the 70s in Germany of the social market economics, where three authors, Johann Messner, Arthur Fridolin Utz, a Dominican, and the late Cardinal Joseph Hefner, who lived a very long life and occupied the place, that Ratzinger occupied, in charge of the Second Congregation of the Faith. These people that were well-versed in economics have studied with Walter Eucken, Hefner in Freiburg, and although they did not agree exactly with our views, they were very knowledgeable, and they elevated the debate of Catholics and economic liberty, which is the first part of my chat. Obviously, has to do with this, with these topics. I think those are authors that have to be revisited, especially today, given the confusion that exists in top levels of my church in topics of economics. Faith not only is difficult to speak, because we all know our sins. How can I speak about faith, when I see my weaknesses? For us economists, again, I was lucky to have Milton Friedman as a mentor, not only the Austrian economist. So I like to look at reality, like St. Thomas did on the scholastics. And I like to try to measure. I know that the measurements are always insufficient. But when I speak about freedom, I have measures of political freedom, of economic freedom, of social freedom. But with faith, it's very tricky to speak. How do I measure? A saint who I admire and help my life used to say, that the crisis of these days are crisis of saints. But I go to India. Saint Teresa of Calcutta was there for many decades. The situation of the poor was not improving, and it's only when in India they started to move towards more respect for the human right of private property and trade, where the poor were lifted out of poverty. So many poor out of India. So I hope I'm not saying a blasphemy, but I think you have to be both, good in our spiritual life, in our faith, and also good economics, not to be blind to the science of economics. And I navigate between these two worlds, and Acton Institute navigates between these two worlds. And I try to reflect, tell people, look, there are two aspects of liberty, and although liberty is a whole, but like any other thing, it can be approached through different perspectives. Today I was listening to a sermon about the Holy Trinity, how the same truth, and you approach it through different angles. And the priest, great guy from Notre Dame now in Ireland, was saying, it's like light, the greatest scientists, say, is it a wave or a particle? And before they were sure there was something, they thought there was something. They really do not know. So I said, well, for some things, we are going to call it a particle. For some things, a wave. Liberty is the same. And for me, as I fell in love first with political and economic liberty. And for me, I define it as the right of adults to use what they own as they please. They have the right to use a bicycle, as they please. But if they try to go with a bicycle to the moon, they will not reach the moon because there's a reality there. But I'm very radical in my defense of that freedom. But there is another freedom, which is spiritual freedom. The shorter way to say it is like in the Gospel, know the truth, and the truth shall set you free, which is spiritual, which is being able to be in command of ourselves. The human being is the only being that, by acting, makes himself or herself. Sometimes I usually quote, there's a great organization in the United States called the Institute for Humane Studies, that was started by a professor who was before the Foundation for Economic Education, Floyd Harper. And in his introduction to liberty, he says, look, I don't care about the spiritual freedom, because one can be free spiritually in a jail. And but I understand, his concern. But some of us, would rather die in a jail because we fought for freedom, accused unjustly, than dying as a slave of our passions, of our addictions. I defend the freedom of people to do what they want with their personal life, drinking a lot, going to the top floor of an apartment building, but if the person using his freedom or abusing it opens the window, says, I want to be free like a bird, and flies, well, I don't want to put a policeman in each bedroom to see what people do or what they drink, but I would not call that person free. It's a sad person. It's a violation in a way of the true concept of freedom. But for me, bringing those two concepts of freedom is essential for Catholics, and recognizing that these aspects are very important. Let me go a little. I like the history of ideas, and when I want to be accurate, I need to read the quotes. So I will ask Manuel Piñero if he could put the PowerPoint. I have a quote from the Catechism, which more than the word liberty, it uses the word freedom. And it devotes part 3 of Article 3 has like 13 points devoted to freedom. But point 1738, I will read it for you so that I don't make any mistakes. It says, freedom is exercised in relationships between human beings. Every human person created in the image of God has the natural right to be recognized as a free and responsible being. All owe to each other this duty of respect. The right to the exercise of freedom, especially in moral and religious matter, is an inalienable requirement of the dignity of the human person. This right must be recognized and protected by civil authority and within the limits of the common good and public order. I put in yellow the limits of the common good and public order, because up to there, almost all, even libertarians, would agree, and some define libertarianism as respecting completely the personal choices of other people. Now, it's great, but I don't think we can stay with simplistic formulation. What is the age of consent? For example, not only for trade, to sell one's property. At what age can someone have sexual freedoms? I like the freedom to travel. Should I be free to travel even if infected with coronavirus, with the strain of coronavirus? I could go on and on, about the difficulty of applying this principle. But again, the principle of freedom is essential for the dignity of the human person and for the church. The next point I want to show you is the favorite point in social doctrine of the church of those of us who love the free economy, and was done by Pope John Paul II, now St. John Paul the Great, in his encyclicas to celebrate 100 years of Rerum Novarum. And on point 42 there, he wants to ponder, should all the world, imagine, this is 1991, a few years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, should all adopt capitalism? And so this is what he writes, what he answers. The answer is obviously complex. If by capitalism is meant an economic system which recognizes the fundamental and positive role of business, the market, private property, and the resulting responsibility for the means of production, as well as free human creativity in the economic sector, then the answer is certainly in the affirmative, even though it would perhaps be more appropriate to speak of a business economy, a market economy, or simply a free economy. But then he says, but if by capitalism is meant a system in which freedom in the economic sector is not circumscribed within a strong juridical framework, which places it at the service of human freedom in its totality, and which sees it at a particular aspect of that freedom, the core of which is ethical and religious, then the reply is certainly negative. I spoke about measurement, then you can put that down. We have measurements of rule of law now. The World Justice Project has a measurement, international measurement of rule of law. So does Transparency International measurements of corruption. Take a look at that. From 2/3 to 3/4 of the world doesn't have rule of law. They don't get a passing grade for you who are professors. You would flunk. All the students would fail. But this is the system that we have now, and distinguishing between this free economy to the capitalism that we have today, it's very important. So I think for those of us in the economic sector, not only measuring corruption, we have to measure quasi-corruption, what's called capitalismo de amiguetes, capitalismo de compadres. I don't know how it's in Portuguese. In English, we call it crony capitalism. And it's a problem and makes our battle for the free economy more difficult. It was providential that after returning to Catholicism, I stumbled into the writings of what Andrea Acevedo Alves mentioned, and he wrote a wonderful book with Professor Moreira, a summary of the School of Salamanca. In History of Economic Thought, in the fifth year of the university, I began studying the Hispanic American scholastics, and I was curious, where do these priests who were speaking so much common sense in Latin America, as soon as they arrived, the first writings in Latin America were for free trade. In the Dominicans, in La Isla La Española, shared today by Haiti and Dominican Republic. And so that took me to Spain, and that changed my life. And I messed up a little Andrea and others who also were so curious about these authors. Those who are interested, my book, Fe y Liberdade, is now in Portuguese. And in the PowerPoint, whenever you can, there is a wonderful portal called brasilparalelo.com, an educational portal. They turned this book into a 6V, almost 6 hours of a class. I think you have to pay. I don't know how to get the rights. It's going to be free. But they did a marvelous job. Those of you who want to study the history of Brazilian ideas, I recommend Brasil Paralelo as a key ally of your organization of Oficina da Liberdade. I did not neglect the Portuguese contribution, but let me shock you a little bit. This is Luis de Molina. Now look at the size. Now this is not the work. This is just the theory of contracts of Luis de Molina. The amount of knowledge and wisdom and analysis that went into this book is is enormous. And I want to give credit. Only 3 years ago, I learned that one of the great authors in the school, called Martín de Azpilcueta from Navarra, Dr. Navarro, he actually, the person who wrote the first version of his book, was a Franciscan from your city, Rodrigo do Porto. No, I don't know how you pronounce it. He was from the region of La Piedad, and he wrote the first version very humbly of the Manual of Confessors, 1549. I'm speaking. There is a copy in your National Library. And a Russian scholar whose first two names are the same as mine, Anton Alexandrovich Afanasayev, discovered this. And he was so humble, Father Rodrigo, as a good Franciscan, that from then on, he let Martín de Azpilcueta have all the fame for his Manual of Confessors, where he addresses, what is private property, what is just prices, who is at fault if prices rise, is inflation. And it's an interesting story because it starts, when I mentioned Manual of Confessors, here's one of Saint Antonine of Florence, who studied in Francisco de Vitoria, the founder of the School of Salamanca, studied and translated some of Saint Antonine's work when he was in La Sorbonne. This is an enormously rich area. Read the book by Andrea and by Professor Moreira. If you type School of Salamanca, there's a 6-minute video that I did summary, and I know it has subtitles in Portuguese, but I have not uploaded it yet to YouTube. In Brazil, they have that. Let me finalize now and go from principles to practice, because I'm convinced that those of us who have the gift of faith, we have to have a much deeper appreciation for liberty. But on the other hand, also, I think that those who believe in liberty, like I did, and economics, need to have a deeper respect for what we learned through the religion and through other traditions. And I will quote, you mentioned the university, the Mont Pelerin Society. The founder of the Mont Pelerin Society, Hayek, in his first non-published presentation there at the Mont Pelerin, he called for people for the libertarians and the classical liberals of the time, to be much more respectful of Christians. This is what I'm going to quote, and the paper was published at the University of Navarra journal, Nuevas Tendencias, so you can find it there. It's in Spanish. I don't think it's in Portuguese, if I'm not mistaken. Basically, Hayek warned about an intolerant and fierce rationalism, which in particular is responsible for the Gulf, which particularly on the European continent has for several generations driven most religious people from the liberal movement and into truly reactionary camps in which they felt little at home. I'm convinced that unless this breach between true liberal and religious convictions can be healed, there is no hope for revival of liberal forces. Mises have a similar idea, saying that if the church being such a force and the forces of liberty opposed each other, the two would destroy. Hayek, by the way, repeated every 7-8 years, repeated the same argument and called the classical liberals to respect more the world of faith. Now, today we see the attack also coming, a renewed attack on faith by many liberals, especially of those of us who believe or are part of institutions like the Catholic Church, who want to respect the right of human life in mother's wombs. We believe that there's life of the human species. That's what science tells you, in the womb. They attack those of us who do not want the states to redefine marriage, or mandating new hiring practices and speech code. The people really who want to expel us from the liberty movement. I call them liberal totalitarians, because great Catholics would have been expelled from civilization if they were practiced the same. Great libertarians, the great free market thinkers like Bastiat and Tocqueville, which I'm going to mention. And we are seeing people going into radical nationalistic camps because they feel disrespected. They're treated as deplorables, that they have to change the religion if they want to be part of the free society. I think we have to have the courage as Christians to speak more about liberty. The Gospels are full of wonderful passages. If you go to Romans 8:21, it speaks about the glorious liberty of the children of God. Then go to Galatians 5:13. We have been called to liberty. Creation itself, but for us, is a manifestation of divine liberty. God created this beautiful world and decided to give us our freedom. He took the risk of our freedom, God. So who are we to take it out? So for my recommendation, for both Catholics and liberal, let's make an effort to bring these two worlds together. And two of my favorite ones who did that are Frédéric Bastiat, who was born in 1801 and died on Christmas Eve, 1850, who wrote perhaps one of the bestsellers in the free market movement called The Law. The book starts and ends with God, and it starts basically in the second paragraph. He writes, "We hold from God the gift that, as far as we are concerned, contains all others, life, physical, intellectual, and moral life. But life cannot support itself. He who has bestowed it has entrusted us with the care of supporting it, of developing and of perfecting it. To that end, he has provided us with a collection of wonderful faculties. He has plunged us into the midst of a variety of elements." He wrote beautiful spiritual words, about us economists. This is Bastiat. Economists are accused of not taking self-sacrifice into account and perhaps despising it. Please God, we will never fail to recognize the power and grandeur in self-sacrifice. Notice the difference with Ayn Rand. We hate, when I was a Randian, we did not like sacrifice. Nothing that is great and generous, says Bastiat, nothing that arouses fellow feeling and admiration in men can be accomplished except through selflessness. Man is not just an intelligent man, and he's not merely calculating being. He has a soul, and in this soul there is a germ of fellow feeling, which may be developed until it attains universal love, to the point of the most absolute sacrifice, at which point it produces the generous action that, when narrated, bring tears to our eyes. Imagine what economist speaks today. Imagine if you speak today as an economist. People have, the moment when I moved from Atlas to Acton, people said, "Oh, I'm not following Alex now. He has turned into a mystic." Someone like, I came out as a Christian, so now I should not be heard. His Bastiat's optimism for freedom was based in this conviction, and I'm reading Bastiat again. God has implanted in mankind also all that is necessary to enable it to accomplish its destinies. There is a providential social physiology, as well as a providential human physiology. The social organs, Bastiat, are constituted so as to enable them to develop harmoniously in the grand air of liberty. He saw God's providence as the foundation of free trade, he says, which is revealed in the infinite variety of climate, seasons, the forces of nature, and individual aptitude, assets that God has distributed so unequally among men, with the sole aim of uniting them through trade and through the bonds of universal fraternity. Juan de Mariana, the Jesuit who wrote this wonderful treatise on money in 1609 and great books on other topics, came with similar things. Again, this is a wonderful little book that Acton Institute produced called Providence and Liberty, where they recopilate even more statements of Bastiat and his respect for God and his devotion to Mary. A funny thing that today the Bastiat clubs are all over the world, and almost that they hide the Christian side of Bastiat. There's another author also admired by Hayek, Alexis de Tocqueville, who expressed almost the same frustration that I had. He wrote, he says, on one side, we have men who value morality, religion, and order, and among others, those who love liberty and the equality of men before the law. And then he continued writing, it seems to me, therefore, that one of the finest enterprises of our time would be to demonstrate that these two things are not incompatible, that on the contrary, they are bound together in such fashion that each of them is weakened by separation from the rest. Such is my basic idea. I will say amen because that's my idea too. Now, let me finish the last paragraph. Things happen for four things: ideas, we spoke a lot about ideas, incentives, leadership, and providence. I think in order for Catholics to have a better appreciation of liberty, and faithful Catholics to have a better chance in today's world to do better in each area, we have to work in all these fronts, in ideas, in leadership, in providence. We know we can always pray. But I think we need more centers like Oficina de Libertad, like the Research Center at Catholic U, like Acton University. Those of us at Acton, I would love to be able to create an international Acton that, like Atlas in the past, that I get support to help you develop, to connect you with other talents around the world so that the material that you produce is known all over. Finally, again, the area that we can only pray, and it's only a matter of faith, it's providence. And again, that one I stake what I said before. I rather practice, the faith, practice the commandment of loving our neighbor like we love ourselves, continue working hard. And I think good work, good research, I think is good prayer. And I think both liberty not only is consistent with Catholicism, I think that without liberty, Catholicism makes no sense. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex, for the brilliant lecture. I think it was a great, thought-provoking lecture. I'm also quite sure. I mean, these days there are a lot of lives all over the internet. I'm also quite sure it was probably the first where Rodrigo do Porto and the latest developments about the School of Salamanca were discussed. So I think we're innovating also in terms of theme. And on that, I was thinking as you were mentioning it that for some people, including some of my colleagues at the Catholic University, it's sometimes a bit odd to explain, or a bit hard to explain, the enthusiasm with the late Iberian scholastics. But I think the example with Father Rodrigo do Porto and the recent discovery made by a Russian scholar shows also how flourishing the field is. So you have people. I just did a review a few months ago of a new German book by Brill, also with focusing on legal contributions by the late Iberian scholastics. So it's actually and it's a great thing for people interested that there's the topic is developing so much. A second comment before I throw at you the first question was on Bastia, which I think that point is also very important. And it's amazing the number of classical liberals or libertarians who actually don't know that the Bastia as a believer. I'd also like to mention there was just a few months ago a new edition, a new translation of Bastia's works. I wrote the introduction, one of the introductions for the book, and so I'd also like to recommend that. It's on the screen now. So Estado e Outros Ensaios by Bastia. It includes some of the all of it translated to Portuguese, includes some of the original introductions and also a new one that I wrote. And now for my first question, I'd like to develop a little bit. The very important point also relates with Bastia and what you mentioned about Hayek and one of his motivations for the Mont Pelerin Society. And this is something which I think occurs different places around the world, in different political parties, political movements who associate with classical liberalism or some form of libertarianism. I think it occurs perhaps more in continental Europe, where people often who position themselves in the classical liberal side, broadly defined, I don't want to go into sort of very nitpicking definitions, tend to see faith as not just indifferent, but as an opponent. So they tend to see people of faith as people on the other side. And I think it's important to go back to Hayek to see, not just to Hayek, but including to Hayek, and the very important point that also you raised, that regardless of what specific faith you may believe in, but that the idea that there is a moral framework for liberty is something that perhaps is not paid enough attention. And I'd like you to comment, if possible, a bit more on the extent to which that may be harmful, that people is sort of in the broadly defined classical liberal movement, people involved in active politics or in the media or other domains of action, and how that may be problematic.
Well, one goes beyond my field of expertise, but and it's just practical. You know, I look at surveys. Some of my friends study the Christian vote and Catholic vote, and there are certain issues like respect for family, respect for life, attendance to church, that correlate enormously with people who vote for the candidates that respect more a free economy. Some of my libertarian friends try to make common ground with the left in things that have to do with anything except economics. They side with the left, you know, national defense, immigration, drugs, life, marriage, and they hope that the left will then one day love free market. That has not happened, and the opposite. The language that they use, the topic that they choose to study, tend to annihilate the people of faith, the ones who practice, not just baptized, who then being left out sometimes, as we have seen in part of Central and Eastern Europe, saying, look, forget it. You know, these people, there's a group of the free market guys who only care about profits. And right now in the United States, it might be provincial for you, but you see, when Acton was born, and one of the founding trustees of Acton, there was no attack on the side in Christians, by most Christians, on the topic of marriage or life in the womb. Remember, President Obama, before the second election that he had, he said, no, I believe marriage is between one man and a woman. You know, but suddenly all those people, you know, you try to be an outcast. And again, I think it's based in natural law. I don't believe only that family, by definition of marriage, and I think it evolved and there are proven traditional values. If you show me that works well, the other arrangements, so far it hasn't, you know. So I wrote a big paper with Leonard Liggio on the Christian and cultural tradition, religious and cultural traditions of private property. Private property was born out of an effort to protect the family, and the church played a very important role in that area. So again, my concern has to do, obviously, philosophically. I think it's totally unfair just to make us Christians outcasts and that we have no room in the classical liberal movement. And I think normal people see that and rebel, because not only Bastiat, my native country, Juan Bautista Alberdi, the founding father of the great Argentina, he was also Roman Catholic, and spoke wonderful things about the church and criticized the wrong things of the church, like the Tocqueville did. So again, I think it's like separating us human beings from its roots. People rebel, and the people who believe more in personalism and individualism, by dividing themselves, they make the field easy for collectivism. I don't know if I answered difficult.
Yes, I think that's precisely to the point. We have a question from Tiago Bianchi, and the question is, how important was Lord Acton's contribution to defend liberty, and how would you characterize his political thought?
Well, as you know, in his famous phrase, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But he recognized that liberty was the most important political value. But just because we choose something freely, it doesn't make it good. There are more things than profit. There are more things like liberty than the freedom to choose. And I gave the example of the person who exercises the freedom to consume alcohol or drugs and throws himself out of a window. So he was an independent mind. So he was a critic of the church. Some of you might know that Hayek, when he created the Montpellier Society, he wanted to call it the Acton Tocqueville Society. And some of the Chicago boy basically said, over my dead body, I will name a liberal organization after two dead Roman Catholics. So again, I think it was an independent person, and I think that he would be open to different types of arrangement, political arrangements, like the church was and the scholastics were, about what is the best political system to put in practice the ideas that we all like.
I think also one important point, one that I also emphasize a lot at St. Mary's, we have an MA in Catholic social teaching, and we have people teaching with different political views, as I think would be suitable in that sort of program. And one thing that I and Philip Booth teach a public policy module on that MA together emphasize is that you shouldn't look at Catholic social teaching as something that would provide precise answers to every policy question. It defines boundaries, so there are some things which are outside of what could be reasonable answers for a Catholic, say communism, that you cannot certainly make compatible. But at the same time, there's a broad range of solutions in which reasonable, well-intentioned people might disagree. And hence, going back to the point you made, Alex, earlier, good Catholic social thought will necessarily involve sound economics, sound political science, sound sociology. Reasonable people can disagree, but they can't ignore the debate. So they can't say, because I have good intentions, I don't care what the consequences are, because these are my good intentions, and that's it.
Yeah, and in some of the foundational documents of the Church, Second Vatican Council, Gaudium Spes, it condemns specifically those who don't respect the legitimate independence of economics and other social science. And I don't know if it would be a hornet's nest, but to be fair, and there's confusion in the Vatican, and some of my compatriots, I was born in Argentina, especially, Monsignor Sanchez Orondo, a year and a half ago, he heads the oldest scientific society in the world, and he's a bright guy, but he said in an interview in Argentina that the country where social doctrine of the church is best put into practice is China, with a concentration camp, with all the control of people. And again, I tell my economist friends who only look at living poverty. China was a great example. You know, more than half of the people who were lifted out of extreme poverty have been in China. You know, but I take the Catholic social doctrine of the Church seriously. I think that my duty as Catholics, when they make a contingent or an analysis of history, I think I have the right to doubt it. And I try to stay within the tradition that respects what is legitimate dogma of the Church in matters of faith and morals.
So we have another question about gender ideology and also environmentalist agendas, and the extent, I think the question would be the extent to which these or variations of these, I mean, you could certainly argue that within the field there are different approaches to these, are something which endangers liberty.
Completely agree. You know, with all respect, you can go to Acton.org and they taped some of our comments when the encyclica Laudato Si by Pope Francis came out. You know, the Pope, when they speak about a topic where there is a scientific background behind, they have to respect what the science, and if they do not know, keep their mouth shut. A good friend of mine, who was the head of the Augustinian order, is now a bishop in La Plata, Argentina, Alberto Bochatey. He used to head the Center for Bioethics at Catholic U, and it's brilliant. And he communicated a lot with Bergoglio, Cardinal Bergoglio before. But when they asked the Pope, "Are you going to speak about bioethics?" He said, "No, I better not, because I'm going to put my foot in my mouth. You know, I'm going to make a big blunder." He was aware that he did not know. And his points about GMOs, genetic modified organisms, you know, is very balanced. But then he's, sorry, you know, the Pope speaking about air conditioning, you know, and big things of science and environment. I don't think it's the proper. He can do it, but as a scientist in economics, I have to try to judge: does his comments square with reality or make sense? But I have no doubt that controlling from the definition of life, health, and environment are the lines of attack of that what I call the other side, the collectivist side, prefers. Because if you control the environment or you control health, you control everything we do, because everything we do has impact on the health and on the environment. So again, I love creation. I cultivate. If you would see what we do with our family, I was part of the Environmental Stewardship Commission of my state, of my province. I love the environment, but I know that the best way to protect it and respect it is through private property and good rule of law. In the Brazilian edition of the book, there is a whole chapter section on how the scholastics spoke about the environment. The human person was always at the center, you know. So, not climate or the animals. They are great, but they are to serve us.
Telmo poses another question on quite a hot topic, and he asks what your opinion is about Pope Francis' thoughts and public political views. So I'll throw that at you.
Let's see. As soon as he was elected, I wrote 2 or 3 articles, have been in interviews, and I try to give the benefit of the doubt. He was a man of few words when he was in Argentina. Being a Jesuit, you know, there's a great tradition of social justice that was started by Luigi Taparelli d'Azeglio, who wrote the best treatise on natural law, where social justice was the opposite of taking from the rich and giving to the poor. Social justice was creating, you know, the institutions and the rule of law where everyone can prosper and develop. Pope Francis doesn't like much economics. His father was an accountant, and he's on record saying how he disliked accounting because his father, certain times of the day, was never there. And so he has a brother, I don't know if he's still alive, who's a mid-sized entrepreneur, who from nothing started selling car parts, and his business became very successful. I don't know if I should say this. This was told by a very good priest, a very important priest of Argentina. And when quite cardinal, his brother came from the province and bought a flat, an apartment building in the best part of town. In Argentina, it's called Avenida del Libertador, it seems. And he says, I will never visit you there. And he never visited his brother because, but again, another thing that I tend to say always, people say, no, he only knew Argentine capitalism is all corrupt. I mention frequently that three of the capitalistic jewels, perhaps not for libertarians, but IBM, Siemens, and Skanska, both were caught bribing tens of millions of dollars to get contracts in his town. And he saw all that. And again, you say, hey, that's not capitalism. But that's what I see today. So I think the closest we can get to the Pope in the language that he understands some economics is through the social market economics school, which presents a more humanistic approach. And you can point to faithful people like Utzner, Messner, Kepner, and work from there. But again, hopefully the topic of economics, I think, belongs to you, Andre, and to me. We have to be better at winning the debates. The Pope now is infatuated with one of the most corrupt economists in the world called Jeffrey Sachs. Jeffrey Sachs had a team at Harvard. They got a no-bid contract by the OMB. This you can check online. Larry Summers, more than almost $30 million. And it was all used internally to favor his consultants. It was so scandalous that some of them had to return the money, and the center at Harvard closed. Now they changed the name, and a similar one is headed by a good economist, King Hausman. But Jeffrey Sachs, again, why the Pope? Who's advising the Pope on economics? I think he is not his top talent. Let me finish with that.
Let me also add a note that before I also wanted to throw at you one final question, but before just a comment on that, it's also, I think, Catholics should bear in mind that throughout it's important to have historical perspective. If you go back to not just encyclicals but earlier church documents, you see a lot of different positions over time. And even the idea of Catholic social thought is not that it is sort of something which is written point by point at a single point at every moment in time. It's something that evolves and is the result of a long tradition. So I think if you take a long historical perspective on these things, some problems which appear very big if you look at just one document or one statement become much more nuanced over time. My final question, as we're getting to the end of our agreed time, and I really cannot, I wouldn't feel good about myself if I didn't ask you to comment on this in the present context. So we've been living through this pandemic and this tremendous crisis associated with it, essentially throughout the world. I'd like to hear your views on how. First, the Catholic Church has acted in face of the pandemic of coronavirus, and also, secondly, about what your views on the likely effects of the present crisis on both religious freedom and economic freedom.
Wow. Before that, people more knowledgeable than me, I want to invite your people. Acton Institute does the biggest conference in the world called Acton University. 1,000 people from like 80 countries used to come. And one of the impact of coronavirus and COVID, it was that the closing of fall travel. Michigan, where we are based, had a very draconian, strict governor that I think overdid it. She even banned the sale of seeds. It was crazy that something that is medical got so politicized. And I think a lot has to do with the power of communist China, a tremendous powerhouse in the part of the world that I know the most, Latin America. China today is the largest trading partner of Brazil, the largest trading partner of Chile, the largest trading partner of Peru, 3 countries very hit with coronavirus now. And so if after, again, some people have been very critical and outspoken about the weakness of part of the Vatican with the courageous Catholics in China. So from the geopolitical point of view, I think that's very dangerous. On reacting to the virus, I think each priest has reacted differently, each bishops. This, at least in my country now, I'm a US citizen, there has been a variety, a few rebel or underground masses, but overall, they tried to behave as good citizens. Again, if some of you want to attend Acton, we have a lot of scholarships, especially for young people. So take a look and write to us if you are interested. I honestly believe that religious freedom and economic freedom go hand in hand. I know the U.S. administration, at least in that area, they think exactly alike. Things. First time in my life, there is a mass said at the White House. Every other week, there's an internal group where before doing anything, they tell Roman Catholic and leaders what they are going to do and what they're planning to do, and they pay attention to the views about life, about family, despite that the president is not religious person. He's like fascinated, like the topic. How come these people are so loyal to me, especially the evangelical? I think, going to my principle now, this ideas, incentives, providence, and luck. I have to believe that the Holy Spirit will save the church, but I think that the big incentives are unfortunately, for crony capitalism to be almost king in the next decade. The rule of the expert, will continue. There will be, people who react counterculturally at the time, like Chile did for a while. But it will not be easy for the forces of economic freedom. Again, let me do the optimistic thing. When I was 18 years old, it was much worse. I wanted to find books about free market and founding fathers. And in Argentina, the booksellers couldn't believe it. Say, hey, no, you have to look at with the dinosaurs, with paleontology. We were about to be dead, all communists, and so let's be optimistic. I think that with people like André, with Oficina da Liberdade, with people who, again, let's be respectful, tolerant, open-minded. Legion forces the people who have different views, as long as they don't create harm and they impose their views on us. We have to have big tents to promote the free society. The founding fathers of the United States thought very differently, but most of them, I think there is a consensus, and I think I will finish with this. All the authors that I mentioned, they all believe that human beings were not a bunch of chemicals. For Mises, production is a spiritual phenomenon. No, we believe that we have spirit, that we are free, that we are social, that we are created. But there is a paradigm that is pushed today, that we are just chemicals, we're just biological facts, and leads to the atomization of the human being. And I think collectivism wins in that. If you turn the battle of ideas of politics into a game of numbers, the many win. And we are much more than a number. Just look into your soul. If you're not a Christian, you know that you are much more than a bunch of chemicals, and that you have freedom and you have a soul. And thank you for your attention and being with us tonight.
I think that's a great note to finish. Alejandro, thank you very much for the lecture and the conversation. I'd like to apologize for people who posed questions. We were able to put a few for Alejandro to answer, not all of them, but it's great that the talk generated so much interest. So thank you very much. And now I would like to pass on to José Bento da Silva, who will close the session. José?
Thank you, André. Well, first and foremost, thank you, Alejandro and André, for supporting this initiative. We thought it would be interesting, to say the least, to share with our viewers and people that have been following Oficina and its initiatives that it's possible to speak about Catholicism and liberty and economics in a different way and openly. That for me, for myself as a Catholic, it's very important that we start having these debates. I hope this is the first of at least a couple more on the interplay between Catholicism and liberty. As a form of wrap up, because I'm not going to take more than 1 minute or two, you said something about the ambiguity of the Catholic social doctrine that allows us to move within a space in which you are Catholic, but in which many things are possible in terms of freedom, although obviously the frontiers within which we move in that ambiguous space are the frontiers established by dogma, which unfortunately I think have been forgotten lately, at least by some people, and I thank you for highlighting that. That was a very important point. I thank you, Alejandro and André, for the friendship shown to Oficina, for the constant support in this tiny little project that is emerging. We hope to stay here for long and to count on you for long. And we also thank our viewers. Some of them are faithful now to our live streams on Sunday. So we are trying to compete with football. I'm not sure that after the COVID, we will be able to keep the Sunday Oficina events, because then football is a powerful competitor and we are in favor of free market. We'll have to choose another day and time that the Lord gives us, but stay tuned to other things that we will be for sure organizing. And again, thank you so much, Alejandro and André, especially for your friendship and for supporting us. It was a true pleasure. I took lots of notes on your talk, Alejandro. It was very good for me.
Okay.
Thank you.
Take care. I will send them to you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
I think we are now